Hi, this is Janmajay and this is day 8 of my communication practice. And for this practice, I'm using this book called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor E. Frankl. In this book, the author talks about his experiences in the concentration camp. Concentration camp were basically set up by Nazi Germany, and it was basically Jews persecution. Jews were persecuted in the World War II by Hitler's Nazi party, and the author was basically based out of Austria, Vienna, and Austria was occupied by Germany at that time. And the second part of the book, he talks about his theory which he developed about psychiatry and human mind, and it was logotherapy. So we'll know about logotherapy in the second part of the book, but right now in the first part we are focusing and reading about the experts and his experiences in the concentration camp. Friends whom I have met later have told me that I was not one of those whom the shock of admission greatly depressed. I only smiled quite sincerely when the following episode occurred the morning after our first night in Auschwitz. In spite of the strict order not to leave our blocks, a colleague of mine who had arrived in Auschwitz several weeks previously smuggled himself into our hut. He wanted to calm and comfort us and tell us a few things. He had become so thin that at first we did not recognize him. With a good show of humor and a devil may care attitude, he gave us a few hurried tips. Don't be afraid. Don't fear the selection. Dr. M, the SS medical chief, had a soft spot for doctors. This was wrong. My friend's kindly words were misleading. Our prisoners, one prisoner, the doctor of a block of huts and a man of some 60 years, told me how he had entreated Dr. M to let off his son, who was destined for a gas. Dr. M coldly refused. But one thing I beg you, he continued, shave daily, if at all possible, even if you don't use a piece of glass to do it. Even if you have to use a piece of glass to do it. Even if you have to give your last piece of bread for it. You will look younger and the scraping will make your cheeks look ruddier. If you want to stay alive, there is only one way. Look fit for work. If you even limp because let's say you have a small blister on your heel and an SS man spots this, he will wave you aside and the next day you are sure to be gassed. Do you know that we mean by a Muslim? A man who looks miserable, drawn, unout, sick and emaciated, and who cannot manage hard physical labor any longer. This is Muslim. Sooner or later, usually sooner, every Muslim goes to the gas chamber. Therefore, remember, shave, and stand, and walk smartly. Then you don't need not to be afraid of gas. All of you standing here, even if you have only been here for 24 hours, you need not to fear gas except perhaps you. And when he pointed to me and said, I hope you don't mind telling you frankly, to the others he repeated, of all of you, he is the only one who must fear the next election, so don't worry. And I smiled. I am now convinced that anyone in my place on that day would have done the same. I think it was a Lessing who once said, there are things which must cause you to lose your reason, or you have none to lose. An abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior. Even if psychiatrists expect the reaction of a man to an abnormal situation which as being committed to an asylum to be abnormal in proportion to the degree of his normality. The reaction of a man to his admission to a concentration camp also represents an abnormal state of mind, but judged objectively. It is a normal and, as will be shown later, typical reaction to the given circumstances. These reactions, I have described them, begin to change in a few days. The prisoners passed from the first to the second phase, the phase of a relative apathy, in which he achieved a kind of emotional death. Apart from the already described reactions, The newly arrived prisoners experienced the torture of other most painful emotions, all of which he tried to deaden. First of all, there was his boundless longing for his home and his family. This often could become so acute that he felt himself consumed by longing. Then there was disgust with all the ugliness which surrounded him, even in mere external forms. Most of the prisoners were given a uniform of rags, which would have made us scarecrow elegant by comparison. Between the huts in the camp lay pure filth, and the more one worked to clear it away, the more one had to come in contact with it. It was a favorite practice to detail a new arrival to a work group whose job was to clean the latrines and remove the sewage. If it usually happened, some of the excrement splashed into his face during its transport over bumpy fields. Any sign of disgust by the prisoner or any attempt to wipe off the filth would only be punished with a blow from a capo, and thus mortification of normal reactions was hastened. At first, the prisoner looked away if he saw the punishment parades of another group. He could not bear to see fellow prisoners march up and down for hours into mire, their movement directed by blows. Days or weeks later, things changed. Early in the morning, when it was still dark, the prisoner stood in front of the gate with his detachment ready to march. He heard a scream and saw how a comrade was knocked down, pulled to his feet again, and knocked down once more. And why? He was feverish and had reported to sick bay at an improper time. He was being punished for his irregular attempt to be relieved of his duties. But the prisoner who had passed into the second stage of his psychological reaction did not avert his eye anymore. By then, his feelings were blunted and he was unmoved. Another example, he found himself waiting at the sick bay, hoping to be granted 2 days of light work inside the camp because of injuries, perhaps edema or fever. He stood unmoved while a 12-year boy was carried who had been forced to stand and attention for hours in the snow or to walk outside with bare feet because there were no shoes for him in the camp. His toe had become frostbitten, and the doctor on duty picked off the black grangoda stumps with tweezers one by one. Disgust, horror, and pity are emotions that as a spectator could not really feel anymore. The sufferers, the dying and the dead, became such commonplace sights to him after a few weeks of camp life that they could not move him anymore. I spent some time in a hut for typhus patients who ran very high temperatures and were often delirious, many of them moribund. After one of them had just died, I watched without any emotional upset the scene that followed, which was repeated over and over again with each death. One by one, the prisoners approached the still warm body. One grabbed the remains of a messy meal of potatoes. Another decided that corpse wooden shoes were an improvement on his own and exchanged them. The third man did the same with the dead man's coat. Another one was glad to be able to secure some, just imagine, genuine string. All this I watched with unconcern. Eventually, I asked the nurse to remove the body. When he decided to do so, he took the corpse by its leg, allowing it to drop into a small corridor between the 2 rows of boards, which were beds for the 50 typhus patients, and dragged it across the bumpy earthen floor towards the door. The 2 steps which led to the open air always constituted a problem for us since we were exhausted from a chronic lack of food. After a few months' stay in the camp, we could not walk up to those steps, which were about 6 inches high, without putting our hands on the door jambs to pull ourselves up. The man with the corpse approached the steps wearily. He dragged himself up, then the body, first the feet, then the trunk, and finally, with an uncanny rattling noise, the head of the corpse bumped into 2 steps. The man with the corpse approached My place was on the opposite side of the hut, next to the small sole window, which was built near the floor. While my cold hand clasped a bowl of hot soup from which I sipped greedily, I happened to look out of the window. The corpse, which had just been removed, stared in at me with glazed eyes. 2 hours before I had spoken to that man, now I am continued sipping my soup. In my lack of emotion had not surprised me from the standpoint of professional interest. I would not remember this incident now because there was no little feeling involved in it. So this was the second stage when prisoners, those who were accustomed to the prison life or concentration camp life, after a few weeks they were facing the lack of emotions or apathy. The mortification of the human feeling was real, and people were not able to, let the feelings inside. If the filth was there on their face, there was no reaction. And the more they tried to avoid it, in the first instance when they arrived at the camp, they used to have get the same sort of filth on them. And they used to look the other way when other group of folks were being punished. But after a certain time, they became so accustomed that they used to see that without any feeling, without any emotion. And that was the second stage in the prison life. I'll probably read about this more when I want to read some of those lines about his friend who came to meet him in the camp. He snuck and smuggled himself in their heart. So I would like to understand the real meaning behind his friend's words, and what was the reaction of the man about that words. So yeah, it's an interesting read. It's emotional one, but I am also like kind of reading this from a third party perspective without any empathy for the psychiatrist, but rather I was trying to understand what was going on in the prison life and the camp. So yeah, this was the seventh video, I think. So we'll see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.